welcome to the Badass Breastfeeding Podcast. This is Dianne, your lactation consultant.
And I'm Abby, the Badass Breastfeeder. And today's episode is brought to you by Sheila Darling Coaching. Sheila Darling is a social worker, certified hypnotherapist, and mindfulness meditation teacher, and could be your start to a more peaceful life. And today's episode is also brought to you by Original Sprout. Original Sprout carries safe, effective, and pediatrician-tested shampoos, conditioners, styling, and body care products produced and packaged in California, USA. And we'll hear more from our sponsors later. But please head to badassbreastfeedingpodcast.com and check out our sponsor page if you need anything. Check there and see if you can give any of our sponsors your business, because they do make this podcast possible. And while you're there, scroll down and enter your email address and get episodes sent straight to your inbox every Monday. And now Dianne has our review of the week.
Absolutely. It is from, I want to say this right because it's adorable, Nebatot. I think that's very cute. And she says, we're keeping it real. I'm not a breastfeeding mama yet, but I work with them every day at the NICU and started listening to this podcast to get an idea of how my patients are thinking and feeling and how I can best support breastfeeding moms of premature and special care infants. I've binged almost every episode at this point and love keeping up with all the relevant new information. I've learned so much about lactation and breastfeeding just by listening to this podcast than I did in nursing school or my years working as a nurse. From evidence-based information about alcohol consumption, comfort nursing, and co-sleeping, the hosts of this podcast keep it real. I recommend this to any pregnant mama or new mom, or even if you're just interested in learning more about breastfeeding and how to support the breastfeeders in your life.
Oh my God. That is the coolest thing ever.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Just spreading that to all the joy to those little NICU babies. Oh my God.
I know. So
and
amazing.
all the people there and being able to kind of intercept the misinformation as it's coming through and being able to give the people and the parents there like just good, helpful information. That's amazing.
It is. It is amazing. And, you know, one of the things that we see coming out of, you know, healthcare institutions and, you know, doctors' offices and all of that stuff is it might have been evidence-based information 25 years ago.
Right.
We need the relevant information that's happening right now. And that's what we try to bring you because that's what we're interested in. Like, we don't care about what, you know, great Aunt Sally did 30 years ago. We need to know what's happening now. And I love that she is, you know, working to get this information so that she can pass it on. And that's amazing. So thank you so much for that. You're doing so much for the moms and the babies that need you. I mean, that's fantastic. So, and she put that on iTunes. So, that really helps us a lot when you can put the reviews on iTunes. But if you can't, you can absolutely send us an email at badassbreastfeedingpodcast@gmail.com. And we would get it there too. So thank you. It's awesome. And now, we got a great episode.
Hold on to your seats because Tracy Cassels from Evolutionary Parenting is back.
She's awesome.
Baby. We're talking about SIDS, and let's get to it because it is a killer interview. Welcome, Tracy, back to the Badass Breastfeeding Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me back. I've been waiting for my invite again. So
yeah, you're the first person that we've actually had on twice.
Oh, really? Cool.
So you're the president of the Two Timers Club.
I love it. I will take that role. That's one I will relish. Thank you.
Yeah. You are the badass behind Evolutionary Parenting.
Mm-hmm.
You have a PhD in developmental psychology, right?
Yes. And my master's is clinical. Yeah. So my MA is clinical psych and my PhD is developmental. I kind of switch gears a little bit there.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And we would, last time you were here, we talked about nighttime breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
And that episode has become one of our most top 5 downloaded episodes of our 180 whatever episodes we have.
That's awesome. But it's something that I think, obviously, badass breastfeeding, people breastfeed at night. This is something that is so central to the breastfeeding relationship, I think.
It is. And I told my husband, I said I was interviewing Tracy Cassels from Evolutionary Parenting, on the podcast, and he was like, man, we've been reading that blog and looking to that person for parenting, resources since Jack was a baby, and he's going to be 10. And he's like, that's amazing.
It's crazy to think. Sometimes I go back to the time of because I started it because Jack's almost the same age as Maddie, my daughter, and she's 10 and a bit now, like 10 and a half. And because it started with her. And I look at where she's at, and it's sometimes insane to think that it's been so long that this has been going on. I mean, I still feel like I'm still finding my feet. So I don't know how slow a learner I am, but apparently not the fastest learner on the planet.
Remember social media back then?
Oh, God. Yes.
I mean, it's still crazy, but I feel like that was just, God. That was some insane, like Wild West.
It was.
Business.
It was. Yeah, that's the perfect analogy, the Wild West, because that's really what it felt like. And now, at least I also feel that, I don't know about you, but I think I'm able now to put it in perspective, as opposed to before where it felt like it was the be all and end all of how we shared information, how it got out there. I mean, it's still a medium now, and it's an important one for a lot of families, but at least I feel mentally I'm not kind of wondering what the hell is going on every day. Like, I still question that, but in a different way, because I just don't understand technology. So there's a different element there, but I don't feel as beholden to understand and master it like we used to, right?
Totally. Absolutely. I used to read blogs and study social media.
Yeah.
And how to deal with whatever. It was crazy. And I think it definitely, of course, led to this community and to the communities that we have, which is fantastic, because I feel like it also it opens up new parents. I mean, there's people that listen to this podcast are, I think mainly, not all, but mainly have new babies.
Yeah.
When they're getting this information, and they don't have to deal with the Wild West. I mean, they do, because that's social media always, but not so much with the wondering where to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Wondering what's happening.
Well, it's also funny because I go back and you think back to when we started, because we were in touch very early. And it feels like we lost a lot of people along the way. There were so many different groups, and it's been interesting to see it evolve and change over time. And it's, there's always, I guess, new fads, new people talking about stuff, but it's kind of nice to have, someone like you still there that I'm like, oh no, Abby's still here. I'm not alone. I don't feel like the old geezer trying to do everything.
Oh my God. I do feel that way sometimes. I'm like, I'm old. Right. Do I even relate to these new parents? But I mean, I feel like there's so much information that they need to have that's just universal.
Well, exactly. And that's kind of how I try to feel too. And I mean, at least with breastfeeding, I still remind myself, I think I'm nearing the end, but I've been breastfeeding for 10 years and my son is 5, still going. And I never stopped. I didn't have a break. I was tandem both kids when, he came along, but I'm like, I can tell he's nearing that end point. I think it's going to be this year at some point. And I'm like, okay, I at least still have that relevance going. But it's
right. I mean, this is the first year that I have not been a breastfeeder.
Yeah.
Where I actually stopped breastfeeding.
That knowledge. And that's what I think is so important in a culture where, especially with something like breastfeeding, it's still not normalized. People still don't have, the grandmother, the mothers, the aunts that all did it, that they could turn to, that in some ways our old age and coming in, I feel adds a level of, I don't want to use the word wisdom because I really don't ever feel very wise, but experience. Yeah, that people can relate to. And I think that's what a lot of new parents do need is someone who understands what it's like and has come out the other end to say, hey, look, we're all still here. Our kids aren't entitled little brats because we breastfed on demand.
Right.
They sleep even though they might have woken regularly. All these things we can speak to and have a level of, we're not in it in the moment just telling you it's going to be fine. We've really been through it and come out the other side for it.
That's true. That's great. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, today, we're switching gears a little bit for today, because one of the things that when Dianne and I were talking about, we love to talk about bed sharing. Bed sharing is one of our topics besides obviously breastfeeding, but bed sharing is so intertwined and goes together with breastfeeding. that when we talk about it, we're often presented with this information that either a person or the person's family, a listener says, I would love to bed share, but my husband is afraid of SIDS. My doctor says we shouldn't because it causes SIDS. And, and I thought, and I'm thinking, we need to really break this down because this conversation is getting there's so much misinformation around this conversation as well.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot that is missing from this. And I want to be generous and say that the people that are saying this, the people that are giving this information, do it because they care about babies, right? That everyone is concerned about the well-being of babies. But I'm going to start by saying that what I find fascinating, the more I look into this, the more I look into the research on it, we're seeing a shift towards more nuanced bed sharing messages in a lot of countries where I think they value infants and parents more. I think the main push against bed sharing still comes from the US. And, let's be honest, there are not a lot of baby or family friendly policies there. And I don't mean to sound negative, nilly, judgmental. Like, I'm in Canada. We have a year's mat leave. We have, a lot of supports in place for families. And so I still have to go to questioning even the motivation behind this harsh messaging, because I don't think it is inherently about saving babies. So I'll start with that. And the reason I say that, and part of it goes, and this is a quote that I absolutely love. So I don't know if hopefully your readers know Helen Ball. She's a researcher at Durham University, the founder of BASIS, the baby sleep information source. She researches infant sleep, breastfeeding in particular with respect to it. She's an anthropologist, so across various cultural lenses. And when she's talking about SIDS, she had this quote that I loved, and it says, "The guidance you're given is around trying to prevent something that we don't understand the cause for." And I think it's so important to think about that when people say it causes SIDS, bed sharing is unsafe. No, actually, we don't know what causes SIDS. We have no idea. And
that's the basis of SIDS, right?
Exactly.
It's sudden and it's unexplained, and it happens to an infant. That's all we know, really. We have all these we have all these suspicions, we have all these correlations, we have all these wonderings, but we don't know.
Yeah.
And when you're sleeping in a bed and somebody who has been drinking or is on drugs rolls over onto a baby, that's not SIDS.
No, that is not. And I think that's so I think let's start by disentangling SIDS from suffocation. And which is what you're describing is there are infant deaths in parental beds. And of course there are, because as you described, we have a culture that we have a lot of drinking. We have smoking, which we know is a risk factor. We have parents that are working full time, 2-3 jobs, coming home and trying to take care of an infant because they don't have appropriate paid leave. There's a lot of things in place that create hazardous circumstances for infant sleep. And the problem is, if we don't disentangle those from SIDS or from something else, we're giving blanket recommendations that people aren't listening to. So even from a safety perspective, I mean, some will, and generally those people are at lower risk anyway, because the people that don't listen tend to be white, higher education, higher SES. They have resources that already protect their children. Mm-hmm. And so if we are just looking at them, well, that's not the full picture. The people that tend to ignore the messaging are those that may come from other cultures, those that may not have choices in the matter. I mean, we think about separate infant sleep spaces. Not everyone has access to resources for that. And there's so much going on that disentangles. So we want to get away from, first understand that SIDS is unexplained. And there's, I think, for people to understand that triple risk hypothesis surrounding it, which means that we tend to view in the research that there are 3 main features. So there's a genetic susceptibility, which is in part seemingly there. Some babies just seem born. Something tends to be wrong that is in their genes, and we don't necessarily know what. We know that some autopsies show that there can be brainstem abnormalities in some babies that may affect their ability to breathe, or heart rate regulation, all these things. So that's in some cases. The second part is that there are certain features. There's this critical period of the environment that's going on. So it's not the environment like bed sharing, but there's a critical period time. So it seems to peak, as we know, between 2 to 4 months of age. And something's happening in development then. I know Jim McKenna has argued that there's a shift in breathing at that point that may account for it. So infants in the first couple months actually have an autonomic breathing process. They just breathe kind of without their brain actively doing it or effortfully doing it. And around 2 to 4 months is when that shifts towards a more effortful system. And if something goes wrong as it's learning that system, you do get in a lot of babies some periodic breathing where they might stop for a bit and then the brain recognizes oxygen desaturation. And so it gets kids breathing again. So that's a more common occurrence. So you have this age factor too. But then you have what's thought to be this third piece. And this is where bed sharing comes in the research, which is it is some environmental stressor is what we think. And these are all based on studies that are not of the highest quality. But when we look at stressors, probably most people hear of bed sharing as like the biggest, but the other one would be things like sleeping on one's belly, right? So that prone sleeping position is really important versus supine. So all these things kind of go towards what we want infants to do. So that's that whole put your baby to sleep on their back campaign. That's those are the three factors going in. And it's that third where bed sharing came up in the literature on SIDS for a bit. And so we'll get to suffocation later because that's different. But as Helen so aptly put, is we're trying to understand something we don't know the cause for. So to get there, we start looking at all these different factors. How do we understand that? And bed sharing cropped up in a lot of studies. And one of the things I always caution people to remember is these studies are highly flawed. And it is so hard to make people realize how bad. But one thing I found out recently is that the NHS, I think it's the NHS in the UK, has assessments of the validity of evidence for specific policies. And they reviewed the evidence on bed sharing causing SIDS as a link between bed sharing and SIDS. And across all the studies, they found that the evidence level was very poor. It was the lowest level of quality that you had in terms of evidence. So I think it's really important to remember that when you hear studies say this, that, the other, they're really not very valid studies. So that's, I think, a really key piece for people to remember here.
That's really interesting. And that's pretty important when we're making these sweeping, national, international recommendations based on, things that are not relevant.
Yeah.
And that are not even, well done, or the findings are not, we don't even know if the findings are true.
It's not surprising. I mean, I've looked at this myself when I did a piece on why there's this conflicting information on bed sharing risk. And, it really comes down to some of the measures in these studies are so poorly addressed. And really, it's in the way that we talk about safe bed sharing versus unsafe bed sharing. And unfortunately, in a lot of cultures where it's just this don't bed share, there is no distinction between the two. And there ought to be, because we know that there are certain circumstances that make bed sharing more hazardous. And it's funny because I see some people on the side of pro bed sharing that like to ignore that as well, under the guise of, but we've always slept with our babies. So therefore, how could sleeping with your baby be dangerous? And yes, we always slept with our babies, not in this modern environment. And if you look back across human history and you look at other cultures where bed sharing is incredibly common, sleep setups, sleep environments are very different. So you even just think about the adult bed. Our mattresses can be incredibly soft, which is not the case in a lot of Asian cultures where bed sharing is quite the norm, they often sleep on futons or harder mattresses that don't allow for infants to kind of get sucked in, rolled in, and end up suffocating with their face in the mattress. They don't have tons of pillows.
I had a Japanese boyfriend in high school. His bed was like a tiny mattress on top of this piece of wood. And I was like, I cannot sleep here. How do you sleep on this?
It's crazy, right?
It's like a totally normal thing. It was just, there was no give. There was no nothing. It's true. It's totally very firm.
Exactly. But that keeps babies safe, right? You think about a crib mattress, they're very hard. And the reason for that is to keep them from falling in. So we do have to be cognizant that we have a lot of these different environmental things, just like drinking and certain drugs. We have medications that cause drowsiness that certainly didn't exist 500, 1,000, 20,000 years ago. This was not something that was commonly found around. Smoking. I know there's been tobacco use for years in a lot of indigenous cultures. However, their tobacco use is very different than our modern cigarettes, right? It's not necessarily, therefore, the tobacco that's the problem. It's all the other shit basically that's in it.
Yeah, those additives. Ugh.
Exactly. So we have to be aware that, yes, our environment is different. And so when we start talking about bed sharing, it's not the same across individuals. It's not the same family to family. And looking at those external factors that we know impact sleep is really important to understanding the research, because a lot of studies, they'll say, well, they accounted for drinking, they accounted for smoking, they accounted for all these things. How they accounted for them is some of the biggest problems in some of these earlier studies. So I know I have read and reviewed ones where they counted any drinking in a 24-hour period prior to sleep. And found, of course, that drinking did not predict any increased risk of death or suffocation. Well, yeah, because if you have a glass of wine at lunch, chances are that's not impacting the way in which you sleep with your baby overnight.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, there's this big issue there that how we look at these things. Smoking, for example, is who smokes. For a long time, there was no assessment of if any parent smoked, it counted. Well, babies don't often always sleep next to a partner. And so if it's the partner that smokes, and we do see this in research with Asian families where there's a very high rate of male smoking in a lot of Asian cultures, you're not seeing an effect. It's if the person who is sleeping next to the baby is smoking that you see this stronger effect. So when we look across these studies for years, we've seen this just abysmal recording of these other variables. And so it's forced it forced researchers to kind of say, hey, wait a second, there's something else going on. We've got to better look at this. But from a policy perspective, everyone's still pulling the same, no, we just can't do it, that it's bed sharing is inherently dangerous. That's the problem. And it's just not, right? Like this is it. We don't have evidence of that.
Right. And when it comes to SIDS, and SIDS is obviously a very horrible thing, but SIDS happens anywhere the baby sleeps.
Yeah.
Right? It's not correlated, or I don't know this. Is it correlated to any particular sleep environment? Or if you look at actual real research, SIDS is happening across the board.
So there is an increased risk of SIDS. Some studies do find it, as I said, with bed sharing. We question, the validity of those. As we saw, they are considered very low quality. They do tend to happen in car seats more. That upright reclining seems to lead to SIDS because it's hard for them to say suffocation because they're not suffocating in the car seat, but there does seem to be something about that upright, the head tilting down, that is linked to a greater risk of SIDS. But we don't see big campaigns telling people not to put their kids to sleep in the car seat, right? That's not what we're seeing here. Certainly not pictures of babies with knives next to them in that environment. One of the more interesting findings, and this is why I say I find it so hard to say the issue is about saving babies, because one of the risk factors that fascinates me, because it does come up above and beyond just the positioning of the baby and everything, is actually daycare. And so you're looking at crib or cot sleeping at that point. But for young babies in this risk factor, the first couple days, sometimes up to the first week, is considered an independent risk for SIDS. And it's thought to be that when we talk about these environmental stressors, that the stress of separation from a caregiver, of a new environment, of perhaps being cared for an extended period by someone you don't have an attachment to, is a stressor enough for some of these kids that the proportion of kids one would expect to die of SIDS in daycare based on who's in it, the base rates, et cetera, it is much higher than that. And this is even when you account for sleeping positioning, safe sleep environments, everything like that. So, we talk about these environmental stressors, that's one, but we don't see people saying, hey, maybe kids shouldn't be entering daycare in the 2 to 4 month range, that maybe we should be offering families paid leave to stay home with their baby during this higher risk or this vulnerability period. And so, so I guess there are certain situations where, again, we see a correlation, but because the research only tells us that we see more kids dying in this than we might expect or that don't, it's really hard to still make causal implications, right? So Is it the car seat? Well, in car seat safety, yes, we think there may be something because we don't have plausible other explanations. It's not like parents put their kid in a car seat and the parents drinking would affect how the kid sleeps in a car seat. But other than that, we still have to be cautious about the interpretation because we don't know the cause. So what is it about the car seat that causes infants to have a higher risk of SIDS? We assume it's the positioning of the head, that curled in the head down, but we don't know.
And we'll be right back with more from Tracy Cassels from Evolutionary Parenting in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by Sheila Darling Coaching. A new baby can add intense amounts of anxiety and depression. No sleep, feeling overwhelmed, looking at your sweet baby and wondering how this tiny human can cause so much chaos. The transition to parenthood is an entire identity shift you weren't prepared for. If one more person tells you that this time goes by so quickly, you might just punch them in the face. Transitioning to a new family member takes patience, self-compassion, and support. Sheila Darling Coaching can be that professional support person that Dianne and I are always saying there is no shame in getting. Sheila Darling is a social worker, certified hypnotherapist, and mindfulness meditation teacher, and could be your start to a more peaceful life. Head to SheilaDarling.com to schedule your consultation today and mention the Badass Breastfeeding Podcast when scheduling your consultation and receive 10% off of a coaching package. And today's episode is also brought to you by Original Sprout. Original Sprout carries safe, effective, and pediatrician-tested shampoos, conditioners, styling, and body care products produced and packaged in California, USA. The leave-in conditioner's lightweight formula is made with nourishing emollients and arnica for split ends, making it ideal for detangling and eliminating frizz from damaged hair. The Miracle Detangler is perfect to making combing hair easier for babies, toddlers, children, and anyone with long hair. The Rosemary can help prevent lice. All of Original Sprout's products are paraben and phthalate-free, vegan, and cruelty-free. Their proprietary formulas contain nourishing extracts from fruits, vegetables, and flowers that the whole family can enjoy. They are not just for babies anymore. Check out the entire line at originalsprout.com and use code BADASS for 25% off your purchase. That's originalsprout.com, code BADASS, 25% off of your purchase. And these sponsors and their promo codes can be found in our show notes under this episode at badassbreastfeedingpodcast.com. Our show notes will also include further information about things we talked about in this episode. And at badassbreastfeedingpodcast.com, you will also find breastfeeding resources, all of our other episodes, and information about scheduling your very own one-on-one online lactation consultation with Dianne. And now we're going to get back to our interview with Dr. Tracy Cassels. I remember reading somewhere, I think it was the La Leche League, Safe Sleep 7 thing, which was really interesting. And it was something, it was just recently, and it was something I'd never heard before. It said that in the United States, these really extreme anti-bed sharing campaigns and stuff like that, there's certain communities that are experiencing, I can't remember if they said SIDS or if they were just saying bed sharing issues or problems, or communities where there is heavy drug use and heavy drinking, that these communities, so they're like poor communities, maybe Black communities. I can't remember exactly what it said. But the gist of it was, there's these communities that are dealing more with infant death situations, that are hard to reach, which I think is funny because, hard to reach because nobody provides these communities any resources or anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
So because these communities are hard to reach, they have decided to make these really extreme policies and recommendations to try to protect those babies. And I find that interesting because I think that actually, when it comes down to it, not even when it comes down to it, very obviously and very openly, we don't value those communities.
No.
As you were saying, we don't value babies. We don't value those people at all.
No. And that really speaks to work. A couple years ago, Cecilia Tamore and Melissa Bartik came out with a paper on syndemics theory, looking at bed sharing through a syndemics theory framework, which really looks at other systems around whether we can consider bed sharing a risk factor. And they, in looking at the data, looking at these sociological factors, I really hit home that, bed sharing is not a risk factor. What is a risk factor are all these other systems in place that disenfranchise and don't support communities that are already at risk because of health-related issues, poverty-related issues, resources, support, etc. All of those things are missing. And that is the crux of where we're seeing problems. And it's why we see disproportionate numbers of SIDS or bed sharing deaths in these communities. And arguably, this hardline stance doesn't speak to them. It doesn't do anything but punish people for having a problem that was created by the culture and communities around them.
Yeah, by the very people who are giving those recommendations.
Exactly. Yes. And that's what I say. When I say communities, I don't mean their community. I mean the rest of our society that set up these systems. And then we're saying, well, you have problems with the systems, and now we're going to punish you for not being able to overcome the systems we're putting you in, even though they go down to the very fabric of, how you parent, the DNA of your children. I mean, epigenetics tells us time and again that many of the issues that families face are passed down at an epigenetic level. So when parents face systemic racism, poverty, lack of resources, trauma, that all go into these communities, that they're rampant there, that affects the expression of their DNA. And then that passes on to their children. So their children are born primed for these adverse conditions. And that affects their stress reactivity. It affects their lifelong health, unless we can set up systems that might once again shift the expression of these genes.
That's really interesting. And when you think about what would the alternative be, what would a perfect system be? I would, one of the things that's interesting to me, what we talk about with breastfeeding information, bed sharing, these kinds of things, helpful information, ideally it would be coming from, everywhere, but also like the doctor's office. Like when you have your baby, and you're in the doctor's office where you are there for the very topic of your baby, what there's always these flyers sitting around, right? With little pamphlets. There's never any pamphlets that are like, oh, here's some information about safe bed sharing. Here's some information about breastfeeding. I don't know. I feel like what you always see is like how you can get more tests. Hey, here's a disease to look out for because we have the test for it, which you can pay us to get. Exactly. I mean, we live in this in the United States, we live in this ultra capitalist nation that only cares about making money and does not care at all about providing information to families.
And this is, I would say, if you want to see a shift, so I'm going back to Helen Ball because I just absolutely adore the work they're doing there. But part of what they do at BASIS, this baby sleep information source, because they are jointed with UNICEF and the Lullaby Trust, which is a charity in the UK, they are nonprofit. They have created for health professionals webinars on how to talk about SIDS, how to talk about safe bed sharing, how to talk about infant sleep. And they have resources, free resources for professionals to use and modify for their own needs. So these are things that you can just steal from them, set up on your own, and be able to talk to families in a way that addresses these concerns, gets to their unique situations, and provide the type of support that's needed. And they're becoming more common in the UK. I know British Columbia here in Canada has it set up as well, where now the conversation around bed sharing is no longer don't do it. It's okay, let's go through when you go meet with your health visitor, because in BC, you get a home visit from a nurse if you don't have a midwife. If you have a midwife, your midwife comes and does the home visits up to 6 weeks postpartum. And they will now sit and have this conversation. Okay, well, do you smoke? Are you on any medication? Are you drinking? Let's take a look at your bed. What's the setup here? And even down to the fact that, one of the things that comes up a lot for families is people try and do the sidecar crib or cot. I get stuck saying cot a lot because I deal with a lot of UK and Australian people, but that sidecar situation. But what's acknowledged is if you're breastfeeding a baby back to sleep, I dare you to stay awake. Like, I don't know about you, but that is like one of the calmest, most, okay, and now I'm drifting off into sleep. So,
well, and isn't that the purpose?
Exactly, right? That's supposed to elicit sleep in your baby and you, right? We're supposed to kind of sleep together with our kids. And so they have this situation to say, okay, let's look at the environment. Let's see how to make it safe for you and your baby. And so it's become a more nuanced discussion that they can have. So my point to this is saying, if you are a parent and you go into your doctor's office, go to it's basis.org. I'm not sure.
We can put it in the we'll put it in the show notes.
The show notes there. You can go there and basically bring a handout, something to your doctor and say, have you done this course? No. Well, then I would really recommend you do, because you know what? I don't want to talk about sleep until you've done it. Like, this is for health professionals, and you can advocate for yourself that way. You can say, when you are up to date on the research, which is given by a group of professionals, academics who do this research, and they've been awarded. Helen Ball was at they got an award from the Queen's thing. I'm so not British. I don't know what these awards are, but I know they went to me. There's pictures of Helen with Prince Charles and Camilla getting this award, right? Like, they have done amazing work, and it's free. Doctors don't need to pay for it. So it fits within that capitalist framework of, look, you can get all this and you don't have to pay for it. It's a capitalist dream. Right? Like, you're banking off the socialism in the UK to benefit the capitalist system here. But hey, at this stage, we'll take it.
Yeah, I feel like that's very similar here with the breastfeeding information that doctors may or may not have, because medical school certainly doesn't teach it to them. It's not a part of medical curriculum. Safe bed sharing sure as hell is not a part of medical curriculum. And if you run into a doctor like my pediatrician that we have now, is very well versed in breastfeeding and bed sharing, and he's very supportive of it. But that's because he went on his own time to go research that.
Yeah.
And doctors, they're not all going to do that.
No. And I think
because
that's
the school's not teaching them, and then then they're like, oh, I got to do all this extra stuff.
Well, and that's what I love about Helen's. Basically, it's a 3.5 hour webinar kind of thing. You watch the videos, then there's an 1.5 hour Q&A that you can attend live if you have it. And it's geared towards health professionals. And so, there's a bit of time that you would need to put into it, but all the resources are there for you to take from. And it is a wealth of information that I think would benefit most doctors' clients, right? Like if you have new families that you're working with, having this information and having the tools, like they have the screener, all the questions you need to ask. You don't even need to think about it. You could print it up, hand it to your clients, have them fill it out in the waiting room, and you'll get a better idea as to how to talk about bed sharing with them. It's such a wonderful resource. So, and I think it's going to be up to patients going in and saying, hey, have you seen this? Would you do this? And getting more and more doctors in the US to take part.
I love that. I love that idea of having you guys going to this website, which we will figure out the exact one.
I know, it's one of those weird like .uk.org. I don't know. All those weird endings.
Yeah. And you print that out, and if your doctor brings up stuff, well, you shouldn't be sharing a bed with your baby. Well, you shouldn't, this, and saying we can have this conversation when you get some formal education, formal information about this topic.
Yeah. And to be fair, as parents, this is not limited to health professionals. I mean, it's geared towards them, but as parents, you are totally able to sign up if you want to do this.
That's awesome.
And these webinars, they're not, the webinars themselves, the resources are free. The webinar was £50, I think. So it's not a huge expense. That's not
money.
Something.
For those of you who don't know, that's money, British pounds.
Yeah. Sorry.
Like dollars, but the pounds. My son, we were watching the British Wipeout, that show Wipeout.
Yeah.
And it was the British one. He was like, the prize is 10,000 pounds. And my son goes, 10,000 pounds of what? And I was like, no, wait.
That's what they call their money there. That's it. Yeah. Sorry. It's money. But yeah. And I think compared to the US dollar, it would probably work out to about $60, I think. I know Canadian was a lot more than that, but that's our dollar problem. But it's really not expensive. And it is such a valuable course when they offer them. And you can just sign up on basis to be notified via emails when they run them. And I can guarantee it is so worth your health professionals doing them. And it's so worth parents. If you have the time and you have the resources, which I acknowledge not everyone does, but if you do, I think you having that knowledge would also empower people to talk to their health professionals with more. Because when you go in and someone says, don't bed share, and you say, actually, you know what? I actually am well aware of the research. And did you know that in the UK, the quality of evidence for this is considered basically piss poor? And so let's have a conversation about safety, because I am, not drinking alcohol before bed, although I may enjoy my glass of wine at lunch or whatnot. I'm not smoking. I don't have a soft mattress or this or that. I don't have pillows. I have set up my bed in a way that is safe for my baby and myself. And especially if you're breastfeeding, this is another issue we should talk about, but the relationship between breastfeeding duration and bed sharing is there's a relationship to how well it facilitates the breastfeeding relationship. And Absolutely. It may not be causal, but it's certainly a relationship there. And we know when you go back to the SIDS issue, breastfeeding is a protective factor against SIDS. For whatever reason, it halves the risk of SIDS. So, you're balancing out bed sharing, which of course, if you listen to the poor studies, they say it can be upwards of 4, 5, 6 times the risk. But, and in that case, it might outweigh breastfeeding. But really, we now know that it's not. It's just unsafe bed sharing. And when we look at safe bed sharing, there really doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that it increases the risk of SIDS. So if you're breastfeeding as well, then you have that added protection. And it's worth noting here, I think one of the problems about dead babies is that no one wants them at all. We want a guaranteed solution that says we will never have this, because there will be people who bed share safely, who breastfeed, who do everything right, and their baby dies of SIDS. And it is such a hard thing to accept, because we feel like if we do it right, it should be fine. But when we go down to the fact that as we start to go back to that triple risk hypothesis, sometimes we just have, whether it's a brainstem abnormality or something else that goes on, we can't control everything. We can't control all of the environments. We can only do our best. And, I love how Jim McKenna, often when he talks about it, will say to parents, you have to ask yourself, if the worst happened, how would you feel? about your choice.
Yes,
And
I love that.
I know personally, I can only speak to myself, but I thought about that. Like I always planned on bed sharing. It was just, that was part of my, my mom did with my sister. So, and she's so much younger than me that was like, in terms of formative learning, seeing that. But I always thought, yeah, you know what? I would want my baby knowing that they were with me and loved and cuddled and supported at all times. That for me would far outweigh the devastation of being in bed. And I think knowing the research means I wouldn't be that person that says, oh, what did I do? And that's why I think knowing this research, and why I say for parents, if you want to take that webinar with Helen Ball and Charlotte Russell and all of the team over at Basis there, it is that knowledge can be invaluable in you making your decision making, because it allows you to feel confident in the choices, so you don't doubt. If the worst were to ever happen, and God forbid it never would for families, but it does, that you would feel confident in what you did in providing. And this goes to another issue that all plays into this. There's the breastfeeding, is what kind of mammals are we? And we're precocial mammals. I can't say that 5 times fast. What that means, though, for people is that our babies are born expecting constant contact, expecting regular feeds, and predominantly they expect breastfeeding. But of course, we know not everyone can breastfeed, but they expect regular feeds, period. And they expect this relationship to continue for quite a while. And when we violate that, that can be highly stressful for them. And so we want to balance these safe measures that we seem to put in place. It's like sleep training. We treat sleep training and we treat bed sharing, or rather solitary sleep, as things that should protect our infants, but we're ignoring their psychological well-being, their species expectant behaviors, and these other features that are central to their ability to thrive. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I think when you go back to the beginning, it doesn't actually protect them.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
But
we're
isolating
not
them.
Yes. And it would be safe to use a sidecar cot or a bassinet next to the bed if you have factors that are not modifiable for you. If there's, I have worked with families where, in one case, I know a mother she was in a wheelchair. She had no control over her lower limbs at night. So there's a lot of periodic movement that could be dangerous. And so they used that next to the bed, the bassinet next, and then the sidecar cot, because that enabled everyone's safety. That was not a situation where there was a safe bed sharing option. And there will be those cases. Some people are on medications they have to take for their well-being. And you should never sacrifice that, because this sidecar cot, especially the sidecar cot, is found in research to be equally beneficial to breastfeeding and everything, right? It is, you have that proximity. You can get your hand onto your baby easily, which reassures them that you're there. It's easy to kind of bring them close for breastfeeding and then put them back if you don't fall asleep. That's the one little side part there. But lots of people manage to get them kind of in a breastfeeding position and then move them back over. All of these things enable that safe environment. And it's something that I think too many families kind of, because we're not talking about it, we're not giving those options and we're not having these necessary discussions.
Right, because there are families that shouldn't bed share. Like, we're not saying that everyone should bed share and, oh my God, forget all the warnings. Like, no, we need to understand the warnings, and you need to understand whether they apply to you or not.
And that's exactly what doctors' offices are missing. And exactly what, again, going back, that Basis information source would give them the questions and the tools to ask, to go down and
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying to go down and then basically identify what are your risk factors. And then how do we work on it? Do we work on quitting smoking? Do we work on substance abuse problems? Do we look, are there better medications that might allow you to bed share and treat whatever it is that you're using medication for? These are questions that should fit with this holistic view of health.
Yeah, and I love the idea of parents taking advantage of gaining these resources, however you do it, because you actually don't, and I think it's important to remember, you don't need your doctor's permission to bed share. You don't need to convince your doctor that you can bed share and then have them give your approval. They are not the boss of you. They are somebody who works for you, who should have good information. And if they don't, it's great if you want to take the time to try to educate them, but also that's not your job. And if you don't have the energy or the, if you don't feel like doing that because you're dealing with having a new baby, then you gain this information and you go about your business. Yeah. And that's having this information can empower you to make this decision and to be safe with your children without, dealing with the very uneducated medical system around you.
And I think it's worth saying sometimes, although we say to parents who are in it to advocate for yourself, sometimes I think it's up to us who are out of it, but still seeing these doctors, right? We still go to say, hey, you know what? This isn't my problem anymore, but I'm going to share with you this information because right now it's not my battle, but I'm going to bring it up to you and fight that battle for others. So that, I don't need to listen to your views on bed sharing, but if you're out of it, you can happily go to your doctor and say, hey, you know what? I saw this, I heard about this on a podcast, and I think you should really look into taking this training and having this system in place for your clients. And, it removes you from having them, well, what are you doing? It's like, I don't have a baby anymore, so it doesn't even matter what I'm doing. But I think you need to educate yourself on this. And it is easier when you're out of the fray to advocate often because you're not tired, you're not stressed, you're not terrified, you're not wondering what the heck is going on day to day. You have the wherewithal to advocate in that way.
I think that's such a great point too, because a lot of people will say to me, they're like, oh, it was so great hanging out here, but like, I don't have a baby anymore. I'm not breastfeeding anymore. So I'm going to leave. And it's like, don't leave. No, don't. Stay here and get the information and be that person who can, who's been through it, who can like support people who are coming in to the parenting community and can, everything that you're saying. That you don't have to just, I'm not a breastfeeder anymore, so none of that applies to me anymore. No, it's all connected, and we can all continue to try to change this system.
Exactly. And, one other thing I wanted to touch on, and I'm sorry, I'm going to just switch gears for a minute here because I think it's important too when it comes to the research. One of the things I see endlessly, and I'm baffled by it. But when I hear about, on Facebook, there are groups about safe infant sleep and everything, and they tend to be militant anti-bed sharing about and anti-bed sharing across all ages. It's just, you should never sleep with your baby. And this is something I want to dispel because even according to the piss poor evidence that we have, these studies, they still find that post 4 months, there's no increased risk, and some of them even find a decreased risk of SIDS with bed sharing after 4 months of age. So even from this quote unquote evidence-based whatnot perspective, which isn't evidence-based because it's piss poor evidence, but you work with what you got, I guess. Really, you're looking at a short period. Now, unfortunately, it's that period that really speaks to us as precocial mammals of wanting this constant proximity, this safety, this always being there. So at the very least, people should be co-sleeping in the form of having your baby in the same room right next to the bed with you and stuff during that time period. No one is advocating put your baby in a separate room. And in fact, speaking of the sleep situations and what we're seeing in the research, that seems to raise the risk of SIDS, is having your baby in a separate room from you. So that whole nursery that you decorate and have made beautiful, it's a laundry hamper right now. So just accept that and move on from that and make sure your baby's in the room with you at the very least. But anyone who's trying to tell you that the evidence does not support bed sharing forever is blithely unaware of anything to do with science regarding this. And I think that's really important to have in mind because there can be a ton of pressure. And I've met families where they have 1-year-olds and they're terrified to bed share with them, even though there may be needs and everything. And so it becomes this, what do we, I shouldn't, it's not safe. And you're going, at 1 year of age, you're more likely to get hurt yourself from the 1-year-old kicking you and punching you in the face in their sleep than them having an issue. So, I mean, there's really not, you got nothing to worry about here. Provided, again, with a 1-year-old, if you were blackout drunk, whatnot, that would not be safe because you're still bigger than them, could roll over onto them and cause harm. But again, we're talking about this responsible situation. So there is, even at that point, if some people feel like, you know what, for my safety, I want to get through that 4 months and I can safely, baby's fit in a bassinet at that point, they can be right next to the bed, whatnot, go for that. The other thing though, is always make sure if you're doing that, as we touched on earlier, when you are breastfeeding a baby back to sleep, it is very common for mothers who are nursing or chest feeding to fall asleep while they are doing so, because the hormones do that. So even if you say, I am not bed sharing at this stage, if you are breastfeeding or chest feeding, you need to make sure that whatever environment you do that in, it is safe for you to fall asleep with your baby. So I always say to families, I don't care what your plans are. Look at your bedding situation and make sure that when you bring that baby into bed to feed, assume you're going to fall asleep. Maybe you won't. And I hear people say all the time, oh, no, I never fell. It's hard for me to fall asleep. Yeah, you have not experienced the hormone rush that comes with breastfeeding a baby.
Or the
overnight.
Exhaustion of new parenthood.
Exactly. Coupled with being exhausted anyway. So do not just assume, because, assuming you're going to fall asleep doesn't harm you. It just allows you to take precautions. And you know what? If you are superhuman and you don't fall asleep ever, kudos to you, but I'm also scared about your ability to sleep otherwise. But that is, great. You're fine. Has it harmed you to set up your bed in a way that would be safe if it happened? No, because we're not talking about major changes that you would have to undertake. So therefore, it's really just an insurance policy against what might happen. Hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, you know that you don't have to wake up and just either wake up to the worst or wake up and feel, oh my God, that can never happen again. And then you panic about what to do.
Well, and that's how so many times people end up falling asleep in recliners, right? Or in the couch or something, these places that are so unsafe, because it's like, I don't want a bed share. I'm totally fine. I'm just going to be in this chair. I don't fall asleep ever. And, then you're totally exhausted and you fall asleep, and then your baby slips into the crack. And that's what we're talking about, like safe versus unsafe. You're so much safer being in a safe bed.
And this is actually, you asked earlier about the environments, and I can't believe I forgot to mention it. But yes, sleeping in a recliner or on a sofa are associated with high risks of SIDS or suffocation, really. And it is suffocation. However, and this is the fascinating bit that I think goes, and I feel like this should be the take-home message for everyone, and why I advocate, prepping for things is there is, and it's small, but there's a case study that was done in research with Jim McKenna and Helen Ball in a supervised sleep lab, where they have the bed, parents go in to sleep overnight and they have the videography, which they're assessing what is naturalistic, how people go for sleep. And they have a sofa in there because they're there all night, right? And they have the bed and TV, all that stuff. And the mother in one of these case studies intentionally chose to sleep on the sofa. And what they observed was, when it was intentional, she structured it in a way that actually it looked safe for baby. She made sure baby was not near the edge where a baby could go in. She positioned herself in that C position around the baby. There was, for whatever reason, the sofa was that thing. So perhaps more than anything, and we definitely need more research on this, it seems like the intentionality around your sleeping environment is so important, because when we're intentional with what we're doing, and it's not, we go to the sofa because we're tired and we're going to try and nurse on the sofa to stay awake, or nurse in the recliner to stay awake, and then we don't, we become aware of the risks around us and we make modifications to minimize them. And that is so crucial, whatever the environment it is. And, we do have to acknowledge that in some places, the sofa may be the only spot that a mother and baby can safely sleep in their house. If they have a partner who is in bed and a high risk of rolling over on the baby or drinks or smokes, this may feel like the safest option. And so I don't want to ever say, absolutely never get on the sofa, even though it's a very high risk when done unintentionally. And I mean, we're talking one of the highest risks possible in terms of the numbers. But when done intentionally, there's at least initial evidence in terms of these case studies that maybe it can be done safely when parents are made aware of what are these risk factors. Where could baby fall within the cracks? How would I stop this? How would I position myself to protect my baby? And, so that we can actually allow for a variety of circumstances to lead to safer sleep for everyone involved.
That's a really great point. Yeah. Be intentional. Do the research and be intentional in creating a safe environment for you and your baby.
Mm-hmm. And for breastfeeding, like we kind of touched on, I mean, it's really one of those things that if you're breastfeeding, you are probably going to end up bed sharing at some point. It's even just part of the night. And it is, we look at night feeds seem to really drive our supply. It's one of those factors, all those people telling you, no, if they feed enough during the day, you're fine. We know that there is research that women who night wean early tend to breastfeed for a shorter duration of time all around. And this is really important to remember, that our babies are supposed to feed regularly overnight. This whole idea of, no, they don't need it, is just bullshit. And maybe arguably you could say, yes, they eat enough, they'll grow, but that's not all that breastfeeding is offering, or chest feeding. That's not all that it's offering. And so there's a lot there that, from the comfort, from regulation of the vagus nerve, to all sorts of things, from pain relief. We know that breast milk has pain relieving functions. And we know that first, 2-3 years filled with a lot of different ups and downs in terms of growth spurts, teething, whatever digestion issues when they start solids at the time, like all these things can be alleviated or at least ameliorated by having the breast milk. So there's a lot of reasons for kids to nurse overnight that we've just ignored, because I think this medical model tells us you only look at growth and food intake, as opposed to the holistic, that this is part of a relationship that happens. And, so our babies do expect that. And our babies, independent of that, expect to be close to us. They expect to have that proximity met. Their needs for that are really, really strong, because that signals to them that they are safe, because our babies are born so immature that they know almost at an innate level. It's not a cognitive level, but they know they're at risk if they're not close to a caregiver, that our job is to keep them safe from everything in the world outside. And we can't do that if they're apart from us.
Right. This is not a trend. It's not, something that we think is cool in 2021. This is a biologically normal way for a baby to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just, biologically normal. I would say it's almost necessary for their development to be close. Like we do, I think there's a reason we see that double the risk of SIDS when we put babies in their own room, is that we're taxing that stress system, because they don't expect to be alone. They don't expect, and that is really scary for them. And they may not have the wherewithal to call out to us, to let us know in those early times, and there's sleep differences in how, the quality of sleep that babies have. We often talk, there's evidence that especially in the early days, babies who sleep alone fall into this much deeper sleep. And I know that sounds lovely, right? Deep sleep, great, right? But we actually know that falling into deep sleep in the patterns with infants is a physiological indication of stress.
Yeah.
So this is something that stresses our babies out. So sometimes when people say, no, but if I put my baby in the crib away from me, they sleep longer. They sleep, quote unquote, better. That's actually not what's happening. That is an infant stress response to fall into that deeper sleep. And so we...
Oh, sorry.
So,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It's not safe.
I was just saying, so we want
the deeper sleep is not safe, right?
Exactly. That deep sleep, it is one of those, I think it's one of the reasons why we see that independent risk for daycare, is they get stressed, they fall into the deep sleep. It becomes harder for that brain, especially at that 2 to 4 month period where, as Dr. McKenna hypothesizes, that switch, well, it does happen, that switch from or from automatic to effortful breathing. That is not a hypothesis. That's just a biological function. But if that's what's linked to SIDS is that, yeah, if you fall into that deep sleep, your brain's ability to remember to be online and do things, it's like when you learn to drive. And I think it's probably a good analogy. When you're learning to drive, it's not automatic yet. Right. And so if you think about it, you need this safe environment to test it out. And in those safe environments, your body might be a little off on edge or what it's doing, but that's fine. But if you throw in a big stressor, you are not driving safely at all. And it is highly stressful. And that's with us having cognitive awareness, everything. When you think about the baby system moving from this autonomic process towards this effortful one, and they're put under intense stress, that's going to make it even harder for that effortful system to work, right?
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's probably a good analogy for it. And so I think when we think about babies at this time, I mean, that need for proximity is just, it's so paramount. And, there's a really interesting study that I saw get cited the other day drove me nuts, but they were saying, see, look, bed sharing causes stressful sleep. And in the study, what they did is they assessed regular bed sharers and non-regular bed sharers for sleep. And yes, the regular bed sharers, when they assessed their sleep, showed this stressful pattern of sleep. What whoever cited this didn't get was that they were assessing the regular bed sharers sleeping solitarily. So these are kids that are used to sleeping with a parent. They've separated them now, and they see this stressful sleep pattern. So it's not
well,
that,
yeah.
right?
Oh my God,
You're just
what
going,
a ridiculous study. What?
So you sit there going, oh my Lord, why? But this is, and too often, and I think it's one of the biggest problems in academia with studies being behind a paywall, people get abstracts. And let's be honest, there's a lot of parents in these science groups and whatnot who liken themselves to knowing everything because they read the abstracts. And you really, really can't do that, folks. There is so much. And, if you're interested in a study, one little tip is that most researchers, if you send them an email saying, hey, could I get a copy of your paper? I'd say 98% of the time, they're going to be like, sure, here you go, enjoy. They are able to do that. It does mean that extra step. But if you're going to be going around spouting evidence of something because you saw it based on an abstract, you really should be reading the whole paper first. Just a little, side note on science there.
Take the time.
Exactly. And so, the other side to this is that these babies that didn't bed share regularly did seem at this age, and this was an older age, I think it was, I can't even remember actually, to be perfectly honest, but I think it was closer to a year. They had developed a sleep pattern that wasn't as stressful being separated. Right. And so we know that does happen over time. We don't know how long it takes. We don't know other repercussions. We don't know the breastfeeding, all that other stuff that goes along with it. But we do know that when babies first separate in sleep, as we see in infancy too, in early infancy, it is stressful and it leads to stressful sleep. So we want to make sure that our babies, especially in these young periods, are close to us safely, bed sharing if you want to, and it works for you and you have the resources to do it. If not, in a co-sleeping arrangement with your baby next to the bed for you during that time. And then to expect that when you do move towards more solitary sleep, that will be stressful for our babies. And it will be for a period. How long that period is, we just don't know.
Yeah, I have a kid who's almost 7 who sleeps with me. And when he tries to experiment sleeping on his own, he doesn't sleep very well.
Yeah.
And he ends up back in my bed. He chooses. He's almost 7, so he can choose. Like, I'm going to try to sleep in my bunk bed today. Okay. And he wakes up sooner than he would. He doesn't wake up really when he's next to me. When he's in there, he wakes up and he's like, where I am coming back in here. Oh, okay.
And that's
and some people want, it's fine with me. And some people want to like try to push it, and I don't have the energy, but
exactly right. I always call it lazy parenting that I do. It's just right. Like, and I'll be honest. I have a 5-year-old and 10-year-old. We bed share. We have the family bed, and it's been a conscious choice that we're quite happy with. It doesn't, that doesn't really bother us. But everyone sleeps better this way. And, my daughter has a room, has a bed in it. She can use it if she wants to. If she has a sleepover, she might have a friend, you know what I mean? Her and a friend might go in and do that. But that's, that idea of shared sleep. And this is something that I think gets lost in all this bed sharing. We need to teach our kids to sleep alone, which is also I think part of the bed sharing debate is, like I said, I don't trust that it's solely about safety. We have a real push in our society to get kids and everyone sleeping independently. And that is contrary to not just baby norms, but human norms. We are a social species. We are social primates, social mammals. We expect to sleep together because that group cohesion keeps us safe. And so when we look at hunter-gatherer societies, indigenous groups, shared sleep is the norm. And, depending on the culture, really the youngest you see kids moving away from bed sharing with parents is around 2 to 3 years of age. And in those cultures, they don't move to solitary sleep. They move to sleeping with other kids is what happens in many of them. So it's not a shift of you're now on your own. It's just a different peer group to sleep with. And in others, where we see a bit more of this longer term bed sharing, there's many Asian cultures that still have the room where everyone sleeps up through high school and beyond. Like it's the sleep room is what happens. But even in hunter-gatherer societies where there is a separation, eventually for boys, it tends to be around age 8 that they find their own little spot. Again, it's still social sleep because the whole tribe will often sleep in a similar location around the fire, but they'll find their own spot kind of further away from parents. And for girls, it's adolescence, it's teenagers, it's 12, 13, 14 years of age. So this idea of this early push for independence doesn't mirror our evolutionary history. And it doesn't mirror, many cultures have maintained that evolutionary history in terms of sleep going forward. And that's what has been missing. We've deviated from it for, I would say, capitalist and other reasons. But that's not a biological norm. It's not a species expectant behavior. And so I hear people worry about a kid. Oh, the kid's going to be in my room forever. They really won't. But it may be a longer time if you're open to it. But also if you're not, there are ways to facilitate it later when your child has the cognitive capacity to cope with some of that stress. And you have the ability to talk to them about this transition and this change so that you can alleviate that fear and the anxiety that they will experience upon this separation whenever it happens.
Yeah, and we go through it because Jack is going to be, like I said, 10, and he has been in his bunk for, I don't know, like a year and a half maybe. And he chose to do that. And I was shocked, actually. I was like, really? Because he's always been so, into the bed, and he breastfed until he was 6.5. And I was like, he's going to be in this bed for a while. And he actually gets up really early. And he was tired of being woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So
siblings, they change it all.
I know. And so he decided that he was going to kind of push through that nervousness about getting through his, into his own bed. And he was just like, I'm going to do it. And sometimes sometimes my husband will actually go in there and sleep on the bottom bunk because he wants somebody in there. But yeah, they do, they work it out.
Exactly.
When they can make decisions, they do it.
And he had that capacity to understand, I'm going to feel a little stressed, but I know someone's there. I can ask for someone to join me. There's when communication increases, there is so much more ability for us to meet those needs in different ways. It doesn't have to be just that shared sleep space. But when our kids are younger, they often they can't communicate as well. We know something may be wrong, but, especially when it comes to fear and anxiety, it usually just manifests as crying or distress. And we may not even know why. Sometimes, many of us who have older kids have experienced that time that our kids become afraid of something that is so bizarre we don't understand what, right? Like suddenly there's a book that they're like, don't even bring that near me. And they don't understand why. And so if we think that they can't even fathom that level of something they're afraid of there, how are they going to understand that they are safe when separated from the people that keep them safe? And we have to expect that they can't. And so if we wait till they're older, then it really does help build that up. that we're able to kind of work with it and say, okay, let's talk about how you're safe. Let's come up with strategies to feel safe and know that you can still be there, that they will feel more adept because you can say to them, hey, if you find this too much, just come on back in. Come join us for a night and we'll, you can try it another night. And they're old enough to understand that. And that is such a difference in helping them learn, I think, these, we all talk about self-soothing. And I know that's a big fucking shit show when it comes to, pardon my language, sleep training, because everyone claims that, you leave a baby to be stressed out on their own. They're totally going to learn to manage that. No, they're not. That's not how we learn skills. I mean, it's just unfathomable. It's a whole other topic. But when we have, when our kids know that we're there for them and they're able to have that communication, we can build those emotion regulation skills. But it happens first through co-regulation, which is that proximity and everything. And then through active helping them teach and learn, they have to have the cognitive capacity to take that information in. And if they don't, they're not going to learn it appropriately. It's as simple as that.
I think that I came up with our next topic for the next time you come to our podcast. When you are then president of the Three Timers Club, we could talk about self-soothing.
Oh God. I will get on that because I have had recently some stuff on there that is very, very frustrating, to say the least.
Yeah, it's such an infuriating conversation.
It really is. And it's and the problem is you hear it from, I feel, people that should know better. Yeah. And, I hear, whenever I hear of like a psychologist talking about it, especially like people that work with clients. So whether it's, counseling, clinical, whatever, I always just think, I'm like, so if you have a client come in who's really upset about something, is your treatment that you just walk out of the room and leave them alone for an hour and then you bill them? You're like, is that what happens there? And of course it's not. That's not, it's not how we treat distress, but somehow with kids, we expect something different. So yes, happy to talk about it. We'll save extra long for that one.
Yeah.
And I will apologize in advance for all the swears that will come out on that one.
It's okay. It's called badass for a reason. We don't care about the language. I know people are like, I can't believe that you curse. I'm like, it's called the Badass Breastfeeder. Like, what? And where did you think you were?
I know. Anyway. I get it too. People are like, you swear? I'm like, far more than I should. But it's hard not to. And
it's hard not to, especially with these topics.
Right? Like, we're surrounded by a culture that almost is forcing. I'm just going to blame. I'm not going to take any personal responsibility for my swearing. I'm just going to blame the culture around me.
It's true, though. So, Tracy, where can people find you? Because I know everyone wants to follow you. If you're not already following her, you need to find her at, where can we find you?
So the website itself is evolutionaryparenting.com, and there's blogs, resources, all that fun stuff for everyone. I am on Facebook a bit. I have someone else, Amy, that helps run the page because I'm not super great at it. I have a secondary page, Tracy Cassels, PhD, that is a bit more sleep support based as opposed to just science around parenting, which is more of a VP. I have joined Instagram. I joined a couple months ago, and I think I'm getting it. My first week was a bit of a shit show, and I think I shared things that looked like Picasso paintings, and then like repeatedly shared other people's posts 10 million times in a row without meaning to, because I didn't understand the platform. But I think I've got it down now. So I have not had many mistakes in a while. So you can find me there. It's under @Tracy Cassels, PhD. And Cassels is Cassels. It's not like a castle. And I think that, I'm on Twitter, but I use that just personally. It's not really kind of for my stuff, but that's just, it's an outlet for politics, and it's a fun one. So,
yes,
right. There's that. And I have a podcast now, which you are coming on. Yes. I have got, yes, which I am very excited about. So you can come listen to Abby talk to me about breastfeeding advocacy and all these other issues that will get her to swear. So we are scheduled for March, and I just started it at the end. Well, it started a couple years ago like 4 years ago, I did one episode. Then 2 years later, I did one. And I finally found the rhythm here. But yeah, it is the Evolutionary Parenting Podcast. It's on all of these spots where you go. And basically, it's a lot of interviews with people who, both researchers who are doing this research. So I've had already some interviews with people that do sleep training, which is interesting. I've got to stop doing that because it makes me angry. But also others that do fascinating research. So this week's episode that just came out recently was with Dr. Megan Azad. And I guess this will date whenever we actually spoke about this as to when it goes live. But Megan Azad, who is a researcher at the University of Manitoba, and she researched the effects of artificial sweetener use in pregnancy on offspring. So she's looked at the gut microbiota. She's amazing. Wow. Her work, I just am in awe of her work. And I have my next podcast that I'm recording is, I'm going to pronounce it wrong because all these names, but I think it's Sharn, you know, those Gaelic Welsh names that you just can't pronounce, but I'm going to have to ask her, right? Hulcrow, who is in New Zealand at the University of Ontario. She's a bioarchaeologist. So she puts it, she studies dead babies to understand parenting practices. And I am, right? Like, it's just so cool. So I have a lot of those. And then I have people like Abby to come on to talk about more of this advocacy side of things. So, please do check it out. I'm loving it because I'm getting a chance to go back, and I don't know about you, Abby, but I always feel like, oh, in another life, I wish I'd studied that. Or in another life, I wish I'd gone back and done this. And it's allowed me to do that in so many ways. And it's been so lovely. Like, I had Greer Kirschenbaum, who is the world's first neuroscientist doula, on a few weeks ago. And she just talked about the brain development in pregnancy and beyond. And it's so fascinating to hear exactly what's going on. So yeah, that's my new exciting project that I'm working on this year. So please do check all that out.
And I'll go at badassbreastfeedingpodcast.com. Y'all, we'll have all these direct links where you can just click through and follow and listen. And yeah.
And then come and listen to Abby in March when it's done there. Yeah,
I'll share that around, definitely.
Exactly. So I'm excited for that. So yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And thank you for opening up the discussion on sleep, because it's so nice. Too often I see breastfeeding separated from sleep, and I really don't think you can do that. So many sleep issues are intertwined with the breastfeeding relationship. And it's so nice to have that acknowledged on such a big platform like you have.
Yeah, we love the sleep conversation. And I agree. I feel like it's so intertwined that they have to go together. They have to.
You can't let you can't breastfeed the way you really probably want to without accepting some changes in the sleep. Like, that whole solitary sleep and breastfeeding really is hard. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard to manage. So we have to have these discussions for families, because it's important to what they want to gain from that breastfeeding relationship as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much. And we can't wait to find out what topic we're going to discuss next time you're here.
I think it's self-soothing now. You've just convinced me. That's got to be
decided.
There we go. It's decided.
And you
we're
guys,
done.
if you have any suggestions or anything that you want to hear about, let us know, and we'll get it all together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abby.